Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting gentleman to introduce you to tonight. Shawn, is it Whatley?
Yeah, Whatley sounds great. Yep.
Whatley. He is an author in health policy. He is a health policy fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a former president of the OMA. The OMA is the Ontario Medical Association, I presume?
That's correct. Yep.
And he's recently written a book, When Politics Comes Before Patients, Why and How Canadian Medicare is Failing. And so that's going to be interesting to chat about. But in addition, he's recently written a fascinating article that I was interested in and is the reason why I wanted to reach out to him initially before I read more about this gentleman and some of the things that he has experienced and written about. And the article is, Are We All Liberals Now, or has liberalism ended? Are we all liberals now, or has liberalism ended? Fascinating. So, Shawn Whatley, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Brian.
Tell me a little bit about your article, and what do you think? Are we all liberals, or has liberalism ended?
Yeah. So the reason I wrote the article, especially amongst the physician community, I guess it's very cool or smart or very profound to say that I am socially liberal but fiscally conservative. Socially liberal but fiscally conservative. So socially liberal sounds like you love freedom when it comes to sex and marriage and kids and life and death and all those things that we tend to debate about in modern society. But you believe in sticking to a budget and allowing free enterprise to generate wealth and allow things to happen as they may. Well, actually, both ends of that statement are from the same philosophy. They're both from liberalism. All you're saying is you're socially liberal and you're economically liberal. And so then I go through the article and kind of unpack.
Fiscally
what do we
conservative is liberal?
Fiscal conservative means economic liberalism. So it means you believe in freedom or letting things go. Liberalism is a very thin philosophy. You believe in the individual, following reason, egalitarianism, trying to make life better for people, and letting things happen as they may. You don't, at least classical liberalism, you don't want to get in there and mess with things too much.
But a lot of people think that the capital L Liberal Party stands for liberalism socially, but lots of regulation in the economy, and the capital C Conservative Party stands for liberalism, I guess, or freedom at least, capitalism in the fiscal, financial side of things, but lots of regulation, restrictions, etc., in the social part of life.
Yeah, so it depends what liberal party you're talking about, right? Are you talking about the Paul Martin liberals or the Pierre Elliott Trudeau liberals or the Justin Trudeau liberals? And so I'll throw it back at you. Which liberal party do you want me to unpack?
All of the above.
You're good at this. So really, as soon as we start talking about capital P politics, capital L Liberal Party, capital C conservatives, it becomes very difficult to pin them down on one thing, and rightly so. I think it's wonderful that our modern political environment allows variety of opinions. It allows parties to pivot and to move to where voters seem to be offering their support. But if you want to talk about these words and these labels, you're really now entering into political philosophy. And disclaimer, I approach this as a student. I'm very much passionate about this for the last 20 years, and I got drawn into it because of the difficulties we're having in healthcare. So I went from the bedside to leadership, and then from leadership into medical politics. So you're forced to start learning about these ideas. And so that's where I take the article and try to unpack that. What we call liberal in the capital L Liberal Party is today, to your point, very far removed from what we used to call liberalism.
Okay, so you talk about Francis Fukuyama and his book at the end of the Cold War that was sort of the end of history, and that liberalism would rule both economically and socially thereafter. And you're saying that he's recently written a new book called Liberalism and Its Discontent.
Discontents, yeah.
And it's discontent. And what are you saying he says here? That liberalism has died?
Well, he's actually coming to liberalism's defense. So in defense of Fukuyama, he says my book that I wrote right at the end of the Cold War when the Berlin Wall fell, and he's on Steve Pakin's show saying this. He said, well, it was called The End of History question mark, but actually there's no question mark in the title. It actually says The End of History and the Last Man. And his argument was there in that book was that for the last several hundred years, we've been debating, liberalism, socialism, conservatism, all these different isms. And then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have finally entered the utopian landscape forevermore, in which we're just going to have progress and expanding of reason around the world, and we'll bring democracy to other countries. And all we have to do is kill Saddam Hussein and kill bin Laden and bring in democracy to those countries, and wow, they're all, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And that was a tongue-in-cheek reference to Mao, which we don't have to get into. But in 20 years, little over 20 years, maybe almost 30 years now, since he wrote that book, that dream of liberalism around the globe and these wonderful democracies around the globe hasn't come true. And so many people now are saying, well, actually, liberalism doesn't have the nuts and bolts within itself to rescue society in decline. And so we're going to devolve into this postmodern morass of might makes right and silence is violence, and we're going to march in the streets, and you got to take a knee for this cause and that cause. And really, that was never in the design of or in the minds of the real liberals like Fukuyama himself. And so we have this movement now called post-liberalism. And again, I don't mean to be an expert on that. I'm not an author and of any books on post-liberalism, but multiple books from across the aisle, left and right, have been attacking liberalism. It hasn't delivered the wonderful life that we all hoped for. And so Fukuyama came out with another book talking about liberalism and its discontents. And so within that, he really starts to unpack, what do we mean by liberalism exactly? And so that's where the article goes there. And just, I feel like you're wanting to cut in, but go ahead.
No, I'm just wondering, why liberalism hasn't worked. And what you say that Fukuyama says, and I guess maybe you say it as well, is that you need this, I would call it social capital. You say social institutions and a network of education and families and faith groups and cultural associations. And Fukuyama wrote another book at one point in time called Trust, which is all about, I think, that social capital that's there. And I think, and we've really seen it in this past year with the truck convoy, et cetera, crying freedom at the top of their lungs, and frankly, a leader of the Conservative Party that ran on that. And I always thought that freedom comes with responsibility, that you get the freedom because you have responsibility. And I really wonder where the responsibility side of things has gone of late. And I don't think there was any responsibility in the freedom convoy, the trucker convoy, and in the cry for freedom from the new leader of the Conservative Party. But maybe that's what you're talking about, or Fukuyama's talking about, is that responsibility, that institution, that social capital is something we've forgotten about.
Yeah. So everything that you've said, trust, obligation, or I mentioned obligation in the article itself, responsibility, freedom and responsibility. So you're getting at something that actually Wilbur Kendall, a political philosopher from the 1960s, died in the 1960s. He called it a public orthodoxy, not religion, but a public agreed shared of assumptions. So within the medical community, again, I always go back to medicine because that's what I know the best. But for example, in medicine, when you make a diagnosis, you know that diagnosis is always open to challenge. I need you to challenge it. Brian, I want you to ask me why I'm so sure that I think this person has diabetes. Prove it, Whatley. You show me how. And unless we have that agreement that my diagnosis is always open to challenge and review, patients suffer. And so we have these background assumptions of challenging a diagnosis, developing a differential diagnosis, trying to search for evidence, and then following evidence wherever it may lead, and being willing to open our being open to changing our minds. So all of these assumptions, civility, following evidence, believing that honesty is probably better than telling lies, all of these things are in the background, but they aren't part of the content of liberalism itself as a political philosophy. So liberalism itself is actually a very thin philosophy.
You're saying liberalism really is only just freedom.
No, it's more than just freedom. And so in Fukuyama's book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, he refers to John Gray, by the way, a fantastic author. Highly recommend you reading him. He attacks everybody. He's very exciting when it comes to political philosophers to read. I would suggest you check out Enlightenment's Wake if you wanted a place to start. But he uses Gray's definition of liberalism. And he says it's about the individual, it's about reason, it's about equality, so everybody's the same. It's about universality, so reason, if it applies to you and me here on our Zoom call, then it should apply to someone on the other side of the globe. If it doesn't, then we aren't being reasonable. And it should be melioristic, which is just a fancy way to say it should make life better. So those very simple things form the core of liberalism. So it's more than just simply freedom. Freedom is libertarianism. I used to call myself a libertarian myself. And then I was forced to admit that, you know what, freedom all by itself is not enough. And to your point earlier, freedom and responsibility. As a physician, I have obligations to be part of this profession. I have to conduct myself in a certain way to be able to stay a part of this profession. And same in your profession, you have obligations, or the fact that you have parents or the fact that you have kids puts a whole bunch of obligations on you that you actually it wasn't a contract you signed with your parents. No, you were born, you have parents, and now you have to take care of them if they need your help. So these kind of ideas fall outside of liberalism. They're in the background. And if these ideas start to crumble and we start to say, well, freedom, it doesn't carry any responsibility. Yeah, to heck with it. I just want freedom all by itself. Then we end up into these bizarre situations where we have nothing to hold people to account. If we have no obligations within a profession, how can I ask my colleagues to actually pursue the evidence where it leads, or to be honest or whatnot?
What a fascinating conversation. We're going to have to take a break, though, and give everyone a break to catch up with us. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes with Shawn Whatley, a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a former president of the Ontario Medical Association, a former physician. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Having a really interesting conversation tonight about liberalism. Has it taken over, or has it died? And I guess it's the difference between small L liberalism and capital L party liberalism. And also, as Shawn Whatley, our guest, has pointed out, different liberal parties at different times are more or less small L liberal or different than that. And so that's kind of interesting. I got to tell you, this guy, my guest tonight, has got just one of the more impressive resumes that I've ever seen in life. So he started out as a clinical trials sub-investigator, and then became an emergency physician, and then a physician leader in emergency services programs. All of that was at South Lake Regional Health Center in Newmarket. Then became a health policy committee chair and a board director at the Ontario Medical Association. Then an assistant clinical professor at the Department of Family Medicine at McMaster University. Board member of the Canadian Medical Association, and then the chair of the Ontario Medical Association, the president, and now a lecturer at the University of Toronto, Department of Family and Community Medicine, a family physician, an author, and a Monk Senior Fellow, Macdonald-Laurier Institute. What an incredible background. And I didn't even go through your education. I just went through your occupational background. The academic background is equally long and impressive. Let me switch just for a second here to your book. And your book was about Medicare?
Yes. Yep. My second book. My first book was about emergency departments, but yeah.
So tell me what the title of the book was.
It's the most recent book is called When Politics Comes Before Patients, Why and How Canadian Medicare is Failing. And really the premise of it is to say that we are now putting politics and all these decisions about money and spending and where does, allocation of funds and how many hospitals we should open or close and what sort of labor contracts should be figured out. ahead of patient care. And so this comes from my experience working as a hospital administrator. I was 5 years as chair of health policy at the Ontario Medical Association, as well as my work in medical politics. So I've sat around a lot of committee tables, and I've chaired an awful lot of meetings and been in meetings where I wasn't chair, obviously, as well. And too often, patients come up at the end of a very long day of discussions. And that's really what the book is about. Why does this happen? What did we initially promise patients? Is this what patients assume is going on in Medicare? And then it digs even deeper to look at why exactly does what we're trying to do seem to fail so often. So it gets pretty heavily into managerialism and legal instrumentalism and some of the nuts and bolts in the thinking that delivers some of the performance that we see. That's in the second half of the book. But the first half is really looking at, wait times, costs, efficiency. What did we promise the Canadians, patients in Canada, and what are they actually delivering? Privileged patients, how privileged patients get special access, and that sort of thing. I'm working on a third book, actually, looking at how we can improve this shared common resource that we have. I had hoped to pack it all into one book, but it was just getting way too big. Even that second book on its own is already, almost 300 pages. So I had to stop.
So I think in survey after survey, most Canadians think that healthcare is one of the things they're proudest about in Canada. Whenever anyone talks about privatization, people call it the third rail of Canadian politics. So why do you think it's failing?
So you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned surveys, you mentioned privatization, and then you asked, why is it failing? So I'll try to attack all those if I can. So certainly pre-COVID, absolutely, people were still of the mind to say, yeah, we love Medicare. There's, I forget who said this now, it's not my idea, but they said there's two Medicares in Canada. There's the one that exists in our minds, the one we dream about, the one that we hope is going to be there when we get sick. And then there's the Medicare that's in reality. And actually a very tiny portion of us truly need serious medical care in any given year. So if you look at the admission statistics for any large emergency department, it works out to about 4 or 5% of us in a particular geographic region need to be admitted for hospital care in any particular year. And most of those people who are getting admitted are the old and the sick and the vulnerable. They're not the articulate people that come on the Brian Crombie show radio hour and tell how their experience went, right? And so it's the people that are experiencing the reality of our Medicare performance aren't the ones who are out there talking with their MPs and their MPPs. So in the book, I start out with just first principles. I say, what did Tommy Douglas promise Canadians? What do you think of when you think of Medicare? And most people think of free care, right? Care when you need it, never having to pay anything, it's going to be there. And yet when you start looking at the reality of it, we have world famous wait times. If you know someone inside the hospital, you get better care than someone else. If, one of my jobs was medical director in chief at a hospital, which I will not name, and I hope everybody forgot the name that you mentioned in the introduction, because I'm not allowed to name hospitals. But when I was medical director in chief of a very large hospital in Southern Ontario, I would routinely get calls from the Hospital Foundation. The Hospital Foundation is the fundraising arm of hospitals. And that's why you see these beautiful, glitzy hospitals in downtown Toronto. They rely on massive donations from the wealthy patrons that live around them. And same thing for our large hospital in the suburbs of Toronto. And so I would get calls from the foundation, the fundraising arm, and say, Shawn, or they'd say, Dr. Whatley. Usually it was Shawn because I was on, first name basis with these folks. They said, Mrs. Smith is in your emerge. Mrs. Smith is in the waiting room, or Mrs. Smith's daughter's in the waiting room. And I knew that my proper response was, no, don't worry, I'll handle it. Or Mrs. Smith's in your waiting room. She bought you your cardiac monitors last year, or she paid for all the pillows, 6 months ago. No, don't worry, I'm on it. And my job was to call the charge nurse to make sure Mrs. Smith was seen, to make sure Mrs. Smith's husband was already into a bed. He wasn't still waiting in the waiting room, or he wasn't waiting
it's
on
true.
the ambulance stretcher.
It's true. We should always buy tickets to the hospital gala and donate, because that's how we actually get to the head of the line. Really? Seriously?
Well, you're integrating two things. You absolutely should buy tickets to the gala. So that's one thing. The second thing about guaranteeing front door, head of the line, that I can't guarantee that. But I'm saying this was a normal pattern of care. And I would be crazy not to go out there and make sure that Mrs. Smith got the care she needed, because I needed more cardiac monitors. I needed a new $55,000 ultrasound machine so that I could go care for other people with that capital expense that the hospital couldn't otherwise afford to provide for us. So you're put in a very weird situation where you desperately need these resources. You can't function without these resources, and yet you know you're doing it by making sure that this particular donor gets, special service, we'll say it that way.
And so what did Tommy Douglas want? Everyone to get equal access?
Well, so chapter 2 of my book, I throw out some very heretical things. Actually, my mom said, "Oh, Shawn, you better not even publish this. Do you know Tommy Douglas has very, very wealthy, famous children? They're all actors. They're going to come and attack you." I said, "Mom, I got to tell this story." So Tommy Douglas, as you know, he immigrated from Scotland. When he was in Scotland as a little boy, early 1900s, he skinned his knee while in Falkirk, Scotland. He got an infection in the bone. Got a little better after some surgeries, came to Canada, it reoccurred. So infection in the bone is called osteomyelitis. Very bad, it can kill you, or it can cause you to lose your leg. He spent 18 months in the Children's Hospital in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Winnipeg at the time, at the turn of the century, was more like Chicago, a burgeoning, bustling place, major businesses. They had a medical school. They had a children's hospital, a specialty hospital. Imagine that in Winnipeg in early 1900s. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Manitoba had already been in place since the late 1800s. So this wasn't a podunk, cow town in the middle of nowhere, bush camps or something. Like, this was a bustling metropolis with a solid medical community, College of Physicians and Surgeons. And the Flexner Report had already gone through 1904, which reviewed all the medical schools across North America. University of U of M had passed with flying colors. And so we're talking about a solid medical community. In that medical community, 18 months, Tommy Douglas was in bed as around a 10-year-old boy. The doctors finally got to the point where they said, there's nothing more we can do. Multiple specialists, multiple surgeons. And the way Tommy Douglas tells the story is he said, Dr. Snow, a very well-known surgeon, became aware of my case and offered to operate for free if his students could watch. And he said, I hate to think that any boy who had parents who couldn't afford to pay for a wealthy surgeon, or a first-class surgeon to come and operate, would lose his leg or his life. So that was the message Tommy Douglas used in the early 1960s to say, look, these doctors are greedy people. They will chop off the leg. They will amputate the leg of a young boy if that boy's parents can't afford to pay for the proper surgery. So they will give a young poor kid secondary care, which includes amputation if the parents can't pay. And I haven't seen anyone actually take Tommy Douglas at his word. And let me explain. Life or limb is the highest good in medicine. Every ATLS, so every advanced trauma course, every advanced cardiac life support course, everything in medical education is about first life and limb. Whatever you do, you have to save someone's life. You have to save their limb. You don't just amputate. You don't just do away with limbs, contrary to what Tommy Douglas was saying. And this isn't new. We didn't invent this in the 1960s or the 1970s. This has been a couple hundred years of life and limb. And yet Tommy Douglas was saying, oh, no. You guys, you would go and you would amputate a kid's limb if the parents couldn't pay. That is total nonsense. And so I go through, just in that one chapter, I review the literature, I look at the regulations at the time. The standard of practice hasn't changed. Life and limb has been around forever. Even today, we have people come into the emergency department who can't pay, and yet we give them necessary medical care. And that isn't a new thing. We didn't just invent that in the last 10 to 15 years. This has been around forever. So really, the accusations Tommy Douglas leveled at physicians as though they would compromise life or limb for money, if poor patients couldn't pay for it, is absolutely wrong. And so what he was promising Canadians was built on a myth. And then I go from there and I unpack other myths that we was promised. The promise of care regardless of ability to pay. We've already talked about that with the foundation donors. The myth of efficiency, and I unpack that about the inefficiencies baked in. The myth of care when you need it. Well, actually, you don't get care when you need it. Access to a waiting list is not access to care, from the Supreme Court of Canada said that. And so that's sort of where the book runs from there.
So what's the solution?
Well, that's my next book. You got to have me back and I'll talk about it.
Okay, so
I could unpack it a bit if you want, but
should we have two-tier healthcare?
We have multi-tiered healthcare, way more than 2 tiers. So if you have WSIB, so workman's compensation coverage, you can get an MRI of your shoulder within 8 or 9 days. You have to wait 10 months last time I checked for certain MRIs of limb MRIs if you're not a WSIB patient. So you injure your left knee on the soccer field, got to wait 8 months, 10 months in some cases. Or if you're lucky, maybe you'll get it in a few weeks. You injure your right knee at work, you get seen and examined, he's seen by a specialist with advanced imaging within 8 to 9 days. The government knows that it saves money by getting you better, getting you back to work, getting you off the disability list. But if you're on disability on your own dime, oh, well, too bad, sucks to be you. You could be waiting for months and months in pain, getting addicted to narcotics and all the rest. So that's just WSIB. We could talk about the RCMP. We could talk about federal employees. We could talk about prison employees. We could talk about people from out of province, people from Quebec. We could talk about people whose health cards have expired. So there are multiple tiers within Canada already. And those are only the formal tiers. There's also the informal tiers that we already talked about donors, famous people, politicians. When someone walks into your waiting room who's on TV, they don't sit in the waiting room. They get a private room with curtains so that at least they aren't being bugged by the public that are there.
So because we have lots of tiers, we should have 2-tier, more private healthcare?
So I'm glad you asked about private. What do you mean by private? And I'll answer your question. You don't have to give me an answer. So we throw on this name, public-private. On the one hand, people will say, well, what are you talking about? We already have tons of private care. Every doctor's clinic is private. Every hospital is private. And then on the other hand, we have to say, well, what do we mean by private? So I'll give you an example. All of our hospitals in Ontario are privately owned corporations. The government doesn't own those. They have private boards of directors. You're a business guy, you know about boards of directors. The executives within these institutions aren't civil servants. They aren't hired by the government. And yet, the government has the power to open and close hospitals. The government has the power to go in and kick the board out and say you're not managing well. The hospital administration has to submit a budget to the Ministry of Health every year. The Ministry of Health reviews the budget in great detail and sends back an even more detailed funding letter dictating, down to the dollar and cents, how much they can spend on this kind of medication and that kind of medication and this particular therapy and that therapy. Very, very detailed letters. So they have minute control over hospitals. And yet we call the hospitals private. So in what sense are they private? Certainly, if you talk to people on the street, they say, oh, no, we have public hospitals. Yeah. And yet other people are saying, no, those are actually technically private. So I would throw it back to you. What do you mean by public and private?
Okay, so I went to the Shouldice. And my understanding is Shouldice is private, and it was grandfathered and wouldn't be allowed to open today. And so it doesn't have the same kind of funding letter that you described, though it does cover the groin, the hernia operations are covered by OHIP, but they also go out and get a whole bunch of patients from other countries that come in and pay privately. And so I think it's a private hospital. And am I wrong in that regard?
No, you're absolutely right. And it's the only one left in Ontario that I know of. I believe there was one other one, but it was grandfathered in because it was doing world famous results it was getting. It was like world famous for being so good at hernias. And so it was just a little too embarrassing for the government to come in and say, no, okay, we're going to shut you down. We're going to tell you to run the way we say you should run. And they couldn't. And it's been a thorn in people's side ever since.
What? Was it a thorn in their sides?
Oh, because it goes against the fundamentals of Medicare. How dare you get to pay for a 1 week stay at a hospital when you could get it for a day surgery at the local hospital, even though you have to wait for 10 months to get it, and you can't work as a plumber or a farmer while you're in pain and you're suffering from the need for a hernia operation. Never mind that. We have this public system. Look how wonderful it is. I think the key thing for public and private for people to understand is that these words exist on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have something like the post office. And I think most people would imagine that that is a fully public institution, right? The government owns the building, government hires and fires and pays and everything. At the other end of the spectrum, and in fact, we have to actually struggle to find a truly fully private example. But I use the example of your child's lemonade stand. Right? She decides when she's going to open, when she's going to close, how much she's going to sell her lemonade for, how strong the lemonade is, what temperature the lemonade is going to be at. If she doesn't want to serve her neighbors, she'll say, no, I don't want to serve you, go away. So she can choose her customers, her employees, her hours of operation, the product she sells, the price that she sells her product at, everything. She is completely unregulated. Every other
And illegal
company,
because she doesn't have a food permit.
exactly, they could shut her down. So every other organization, to your point, in Canada, whether it's a bakery or a corner store, and certainly when you get into medicine, you're moving way along that spectrum towards public. Everybody exists within some sort of regulatory framework. So if it's the local hot dog stand, they need a permit, they need a license, everybody needs something. And so they're moving away from the lemonade stand, the fully private example, towards a more fully public system. And so I put the argument to people who say, well, we already have private doctors' clinics. We already have private, the so-called public hospitals are actually technically owned, privately owned corporations. I asked them, in what sense is my local hospital a private organization? To me, it looks to be completely public. It's controlled by the government. It's funded by the government. The government can open it or shut it down or approve an increase in beds or decrease in beds. In Manitoba, a few years ago, a provincial election hinged on the quality of toast, as in cooked bread, the quality of toast served in hospitals. Political parties were arguing about who could do a better job at guaranteeing an improvement of the quality of toast.
Well, the food at a lot of hospitals I've been at is pretty crappy, so I can understand that completely. We're going to take a break and come back more with Shawn Whatley in just 2 minutes. And we're going to go back to the conversation about liberalism and freedom and fiscal conservatism versus social progressives and what comes next and what the future is. And Shawn, when you come out with this book that's the solution to Medicare, you got to come back, buddy. Like, I really want to have this conversation in the future. No question about it. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Sounds great.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Shawn Whatley, who is a former president of the Ontario Medical Association. He's a former professor. He's a former emergency room doctor and a family physician. And he's currently a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute dealing with health policy. He's written a fascinating article just a couple of weeks ago called "Are We All Liberals Now, or Has Liberalism Ended?" And he's talking about how most people he thinks are in the center and call themselves you say socially liberal. I don't think that that's what people say. I think they say social progressives. So they're socially progressive and they're fiscally conservative or fiscally prudent or something like that. And I agree with you. I think that's where the vast majority of people are. And maybe it's blue liberals, red Tories, or there's an organization that I think some people from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute are part of called they were called centrist conservatives. They're now called centrist Canadians that are in that sort of place in the middle, which I think that, frankly, Jean Charest, who lost the conservative leadership, was. And you mentioned earlier Paul Martin liberal versus a Justin Trudeau liberal. I think that's where the Paul Martin liberals were, and maybe even the John Turner liberals before he went against free trade. But probably not the Jean Chrétien liberals, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau liberals, or the Justin Trudeau liberals. But then you talk about how liberalism has failed, and And I really think that this is the other side of freedom, which is the responsibility. It's the social capital. It's the institutions. It's things like you call it voluntary associations, educational networks, families, faith groups, cultural associations, and more. And that really is the glue that kept society together. Fukuyama called it the trust was the glue that keeps people together, and being willing to work with one another. And without trust, you've lost that glue. Freedom may be the grease that keeps things going, but the glue is the social capital, the trust. You then say, what comes next? And I really like this because you ask a couple of questions, and you say, we cannot turn back time. Current struggles could last decades as we search for answers. Why care about individuals? Does society make individuals, or do individuals make society? Is equality an absolute or relative good? What do we mean by progress? Does reason have limits? And then I love this final one. Can we ever be truly rational, or are we tragically tied to sentiment, habit, and prejudice? And a lot of people have been recently looking at sort of social economics, and have come to the conclusion, or behavioral economics, I guess, is the more accurate word, and have said that there isn't that rational man that a lot of sort of liberal economists described, because we are so influenced by sentiment, habit, and prejudice. I've interviewed a bunch of real estate people lately, and you know, it's interesting. We all were excited about buying when the market was high, and scared of selling when and buying when the market, and I'm scared of buying when the market's low. And so we were doing the opposite of what you should do. We were buying when it was high, and we're not buying when it's low because of sentiment, because we're scared. And so what's your answer? What does come next? And I guess I gotta add, a couple of other things to this, because we're seeing a rise in the last couple of years of authoritarianism worldwide, and then protests against authoritarianism. And probably the biggest one is right now in Iran, which is shocking. And it was interesting because they didn't object when it was politics, but when it was a murder of a young girl, they start to object. I think a lot of people thought that Putin was going to be successful in Ukraine, and authoritarianism and a strong military would win. But for some reason, democratic Ukraine fought back. And I've interviewed several people there that said they were actually surprised at the spirit of the Ukrainians. And it was because they've actually got excited about being part of the West, being democratic, having freedom. And that was exciting. So is liberalism under challenge? Or maybe is this the true end of history and the future of liberalism?
Wow. You've scribbling notes as you were talking. There are so many directions we could take this. I think, to your point, yeah, we are at an epoch of change. We are at a turning of the tide. And that's why you're seeing all these books and articles about liberalism, how it's failing. Now, to be clear, modernity, a lot of people say, ended sometime between 1965 and 1995, or 1970 and 1990. Somewhere in there, the old, shall we say, the rapprochement, or the old deal between in the political sphere died, and liberalism has been sort of it's crumbling over the last 40 or 50 years. But to your point, I think when we're at a time of change, we're forced to ask all these big, basic questions all over again. So it's almost like we're going back to the early Greek philosophers, right? So one of the radical things that happened at Athens was they said, we want to debate divergent opinions. Our school celebrates heterodoxy. Our school celebrates people saying things that are heretical so that we can learn from them and debate
is that liberal?
them.
Is that liberalism? Is that freedom?
Well, that's liberalism took that concept. That concept flows all through Western society.
So have we lost that today when we're listening only to CNN or Fox, and we're living in echo chambers?
I believe we have. And so prior to that, it was about orthodoxy. You must speak this one truth. And a lot of times during Christendom, we saw that falling back towards this, no, this is the only truth that you need to arrive at. And we've seen that in the 20th century with liberalism and certainly within the bioethics community, where we wanted to get this canonical morality. I'll geek out on you a little bit. In the early edition of the Principles of Bioethics, Beauchamp and Childress, they appealed to a common morality, and they came out with the Georgetown mantra. Every doctor has to learn this: autonomy, patient autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice or jurisprudence. And so they appealed to those four concepts as just self-evident. They were just obvious. Everybody knows this. Well, by their 8th and 9th, I believe they're in their 8th edition, they might even be in their 9th edition, they have a great deal of trouble trying to appeal to what exactly is this common morality? What is this shared idea of the common good? So beneficence, what does it mean to be good and do something good to patients? What is the good? And so I think we're in a wonderful opportunity to start asking these questions all over again and trying to go back and fumble around in the dark to figure out these ideas. How did we arrive at these wonderful set of ideas that allowed us to have truly liberal societies? You mentioned populism, majoritarianism. Why do we trust people? Why do we trust people that maybe had no education at all? You mentioned sentiment. I mean, most of my patients in my area are farmers. Most of them, many of them have had no formal education. Some of the smartest people I know, so wise, so full of common sense. And they have a very clear understanding about, okay, this is probably a reasonable way to approach a particular problem that they may have never seen before in their lives. And so that sort of gets at the basis of why do we have democracy in the first place? But we're having to ask all these questions over again, work them through again, and then figure out, how do we develop them? How do you develop a sense of social trust? Well, trust comes from doing the things you and I are doing here now. We haven't been arguing much. But I'd love to argue with you more, but I want to be invited back. So I've been trying to be careful to agree with you. That's not quite true. I'm happy to argue with you at any point. But unless we foster civil debate and the institutions where we have a safe spot for you to disagree with me or to throw out something provocative and me to throw something provocative back at you, and that's what helps build social trust. If we live in insular communities that really don't know anything about our next door neighbors or the person down the road, we'd have no reason to build things together or share experiences together. Social trust has a hard time to survive. So you asked where we need to go, what do we need to do? I think that's what we have to go. I'll close with this comment too. You mentioned about reason and how maybe we aren't reasonable. I believe it was Hume, you'll have to correct me on this, I believe it was David Hume, philosopher, said that reason is the slave of the passions. And so really it's our passions that end up driving us.
Slave of the passions.
Yeah, I believe it was Hume. So I can Google it afterwards and tell you whether or not I remember that correctly. But there's a great book out just in the last couple of years called The Myth of the Rational Voter. I have it on my desk and I can't remember the author. I apologize. But he goes into look why people actually don't vote in their rational self-interest. And so this myth of homo economicus, that we will only always make decisions based on what is in our economic best interest, is perhaps not true. We have other things that motivate us. And so we're in a wonderful, wonderful time. It's very disruptive. It's very scary for a lot of people, but we have the opportunity to start looking at these fundamental questions again and deciding, okay, is this something that we actually like? Do we like our way of life here in Canada or in the West? In the Western world? Or is this something that we just want to say it's all evil, it's all terrible, it's colonialism and genocidal and hateful, and we should just tear it all up and start over and write a brand new constitution? Well, other countries have tried that and it hasn't worked out too well. So I think it behooves people like you and me to start asking these questions and engaging other people and saying, why do we care about individuals? Why shouldn't I punch you in the face if I disagree with you, if I can get away with it? And all of these fundamental questions are up for grabs again. And so that's where I think we need to start. Ask the questions, search for answers, and start building social trust. We're in this together. How can we build a wonderful country or keep the wonderful country that we have?
Well, I think, frankly, it comes down to one of the comments I made earlier in our comment, that with freedom comes a need for responsibility. And too much of late, we've just been yelling freedom at the top of our lungs and thinking that that gives us the right to set up a bouncy castle on a main drag and or maybe not punch someone in the face, but certainly yell at them if they're wearing a mask and tell them to take it off. And that we want freedom for ourselves, but we're not willing to give freedom to other people. And I think that having responsibility, making sure that we drive on the right-hand side of the road. We don't have the freedom to drive in the middle or on the left-hand side of the road. We accept that. With freedom in society, you've got to accept responsibility for the health, the wealth, the life of the others. And I think that is social capital. I think that's social trust. I think that's civil capital. I think that's what makes societies work. Anyway, fascinating conversation. We're going to have to go ahead.
So I was just going to jump in on your freedom comment. So Bill Gardner actually has a wonderful rubric for unpacking this. He talks about how liberalism has changed. Initially, people came to North America because they wanted freedom to be good, and he calls it virtue liberalism. Then they wanted material liberalism. They wanted freedom to actually build businesses and get stuff for themselves, improve their way of life. Then they had equality liberalism. So they became convicted, shall we say, or bothered by the fact that there were rich and poor, and some people had stuff and some people didn't have stuff. And so they turned to government to try to have equality. So equality liberalism as a third stage of liberalism. He says now we have libertarian socialism, where you can do whatever the heck you want with your body as long as you don't hurt someone or take their stuff. But we need a great big government to take care of us if anything goes bad. So freedom without responsibility, because, hey, the government's going to take care of the responsibility. So he would argue that that's the fourth stage of liberalism that we're in right now, and he calls it libertarian socialism. So I love what you're saying.
It's not liberalism. I
agree.
Disagree. I agree. We've got to go. Thank you so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, Brian.
I'm so sorry.